We face the challenge, the growing challenge of the issue of global warming. The question of how we build businesses and enterprises that are not just economically viable, but ecologically sustainable at the same time. We face the pressures that come with the threat of pandemic disease. You know, there is no equivalent of penicillin for viruses. Hence the problem with H5N1, H1N1, and the threat to humanity. And for us in business, it means a challenge to find contingency plans, continuity plans, if anything like this should ever break out among the human population. We've had, I suppose, the biggest challenge in the last 5 years is recession, or the credit crunch, or the financial downturn, or whatever you want to call it. It's the same thing in any terminology. And you can't measure recession, ladies and gentlemen, in metrics alone. This is where the media often, I think, gets it wrong, and I've told them so. You cannot measure the effects of recession in numbers. In fact, for many people, it's the numbers that got us into the problem in the first place. This particular formula, the Gaussian copula function, was composed by an American mathematician called David X. Lee in the year 2000. It measures, or purports to measure, correlation between certain kinds of disparate risk, unrelated risk. But money traders took it and tried to use it as a way of determining where they should place their bets, using, of course, other people's money. And you know the story. Whole pension funds have gone belly up in America, in Europe, in other parts of the world, because you simply cannot reduce something as complex as human behavior to a mathematical formula, even one as elegant, apparently, as this one. And over the next decade, we as a society here in Australia, we in the developed world generally, are going to face some very pressing social and corporate issues which will impact upon every enterprise we run, whether it's a community enterprise, a corporate or business enterprise. In our work at 2020 Plus, which is a think tank in London on social change, we've identified 10 that we call the big 10 areas that will affect society and business the most in the next decade. I don't have time to talk about all 10 today. That would take 2 hours on its own. But just to highlight a couple for you before I move on. Urbanisation is a huge issue here in Australia and will be over the next 10 years. The challenge of finding dwelling places for people that are close to the urban centre. It takes 6 to 14 years in Australia, on average, to turn land on the urban fringes into viable dwellings, which is a long time by world standards. Urbanisation, 50% of the world today lives in cities, most of you know that. India will overtake China by the year 2030 as the world's most populous country, and 60% of India at that time will live in big cities, which will quadruple their energy consumption, their energy requirements, and that has huge implications, of course, for issues like global warming. Another one on the list that's key for us is hypertechnology. Nanotech, biotech will lead to huge advances in medicine, but it will also mean big differences in economies and trade practices. Some of my fellow futurists are predicting now that by 2030, most of the Western world will be cashless. I'm not so sure. I think there are great advantages to cash. It's hard to rob someone's ID from the cash they carry, as against a card. But having said that, there will be a tremendous surge in what we call wave and pay technologies, using RFIDs, radio frequency ID tags, things that are as small as a grain of sand, but they contain a transmitter, a receiver, memory, and battery, all within this grain of sand. And if you've ever traveled on an underground system anywhere in the world, you know about the Oyster cards. The only reason you have the plastic card is so that you can hold a piece of sand that's inside of it, which contains the information the system needs to run. And so in the Olympics in 2012 in London, we'll be using wave and pay to get into the games. Slide your phone across the payer, you're in. Slide your phone across the payer, you buy a hot dog. Soon we'll be using that in items of clothing. Some are predicting we will even use it within the human body as a way of trading. Aging is a huge area of interest if you're in business today, and I want to come to that in the second session, really. But we are facing a synthesis of two challenges: falling fertility rates in the Western world, alongside rapidly aging and longer living populations. And what this means is that as one group, particularly us boomers, move out of employment and retire, there will be nobody, in some instances, to follow up with our particular skills. That presents a great challenge for us in the corporate and civic realms. Let me just touch on one more here in the 10, and that is the growth of anxiety and paranoia. In 2007 in Sydney, there was a global conference of psychiatrists, very reputable people in their field, all had written peer-reviewed research papers. And they found, in their press release, they declared it, that we have entered the age of paranoia. According to a leading British psychiatrist, 1 in 4 Britons today is suffering from an irrational fear of some kind or another, and most of that is linked to urban isolation, being alone in a crowd. I think we're going to see a rapid growth in the corporate world, in the area of corporate psychologists. The area of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, in the corporate world is going to grow rapidly over the next 10 years because of the fear factor. And let's face it today, media builds a constituency often on fear. Some politicians build a constituency on fear. It's a big market. It's a big industry, is fear. Security companies, obviously, feed on a sense of fear. So we can expect to have to deal with that in the business world. But of all those challenges, there's one thing that remains true. It's not the technology that shapes the future. And it's not events that shapes the future. Not even wildcard events. We call them low probability, high impact events like volcanoes in Iceland that even the Icelanders can't pronounce, going up and grounding all of Europe's airlines for a week. No one predicted it. Low probability, high impact when it happens. Even wildcard events like that do not shape the future. What shapes the future, ladies and gentlemen, is human choice.